Alright, Mark Twain. If you're like me, you grew up in the South, uh, you probably, in middle school, or maybe even in high school, you probably read some of his works, like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, some of his most prominent works, and maybe some of his other short stories. He's certainly one of, if not the most greatest figures of American literature. If you ask the common person on the street who the face of American literature was, they would probably say Mark Twain. Alright, so Mark Twain was born on November 30th, 1835 in Florida, Missouri. Florida, Missouri is no longer a town, but it is a state park there that honors Mark Twain. He was actually raised in Hannibal, Missouri, along the Mississippi River, which inspired many of his writings. And his actual name was Samuel Langhorne Clemens. His pen name was just Mark Twain, which he coined when he was in Nevada, when he first wrote for the Territorial Enterprise after failing to be a miner in Nevada. He was known as just a humorist. A lot of his works were kind of comical. Some of them are tragic. If you read, like what we read in my previous World Literature 2 class, we read Pudd'nhead Wilson. That ended up being a tragedy. But when he grew up, he wanted to be a steamboat pilot, so he obtained his pilot's license in order to do so. He traveled out west along with his brother, Orion Clemens. His brother was actually the secretary over the territory of Nevada before Nevada became a state. And he wrote about, as we will see in one of his works, Roughing It, he wrote about his encounters with the Mormons and miners and other people out west. And he became a miner out there, but he failed to do so there, and he eventually wrote for the Territorial Enterprise, in which he coined the pen name Mark Twain. He eventually married Olivia Langdon, in which he, through her, she was a very wealthy lady, came from a wealthy family. He actually got to meet Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass, which inspired his thoughts on being an abolitionist and being anti-slavery. He incurred some financial problems in his life. He had some failed investments that went on, malinvestments, but he was able to pay off some of those debts that he owed through his lectures that he took on in July of 1895. He began traveling the world to lecture. And then he eventually passed away, of course, had a heart attack on April 21st, 1910. One of his, of course, his most famous works are The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, as well as The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Of course, most people know and have read Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Tom Sawyer, of course, is about a young boy named Tom Sawyer who grew up in St. Petersburg, which is a fictional town, and it's a town along the Mississippi River, and it's inspired by where Mark Twain grew up. Various adventures that Tom Sawyer goes on reflect on Mark Twain's life. And of course, Huckleberry Finn is in the novel, and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, of course, is the sequel to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Huckleberry Finn runs away from home and encounters a slave named Jim. Now, this book is interesting because it deals with, we can see some of Mark Twain's early anti-racist narratives he brings in. The young boy, Huckleberry Finn, becomes friends with this runaway slave named Jim. They go up the Mississippi River towards the free states, and it is a very good read if anybody hasn't read it, which I don't know of anybody that hasn't read Huckleberry Finn, but it is a great novel. Now, my favorite of Mark Twain is his memoir, which is Life on the Mississippi. He discusses his when he was a steamboat pilot. He sailed from St. Louis to New Orleans. It talks about the personal experiences on the Mississippi River. It first goes into the history of the Mississippi River, discusses some of the more famous people that have traveled on the Mississippi, who have done, researched, and then it goes along. There's a lot of imagery in this book. Discusses the various cities that sit on the Mississippi River, and this is for anyone who is interested in Southern history and Southern literature. This is a very good book to read. Now, one of the more comical books Mark Twain wrote was The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. And it's about a man named Jim Smiley who has a frog that he has trained. And Jim Smiley is this sort of cunning gambler. He wins a lot of bets, but he eventually encounters a stranger who bets $40 that his frog can't jump where he wants him to jump, where Smiley wants him to jump. But while Jim Smiley has his back turned, the stranger feeds the frog buckshot to weigh him down, and he loses the bet. So it's sort of a comical book. It's also has some moral dilemmas in the book as well. Jim Smiley, as I mentioned before, is a cunning gambler. He sort of gets a lesson learned here in this novel. Now, as I mentioned before, Roughing It is a book that has some humor in it, but it's pretty much Mark Twain's memoir when he traveled out west to Nevada with his brother Orion Clemens. And it just discusses the life in the mountains of the West. As I mentioned before, he encounters Mormons, he encounters different miners, he becomes a miner himself. Of course, he fails that, becomes a writer for the Territorial Enterprise. But it's an interesting read. It gives the reader, especially those with an interest in history, a look at out west, what people encountered out west, the life and how rough it was out there. Well, Mark Twain certainly left a legacy on American literature. I wanted to discuss a couple of things. As I mentioned before, he was an abolitionist. Perhaps his abolition of slavery came from just talking with Frederick Douglass, talking with people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who he met through his wife. And I just thought that was very interesting. And he also became an anti-imperialist because the American Empire in the early 20th century was expanding their empire and taking over Caribbean islands and even the Philippines. And the United States had also went to war with Spain in the Spanish-American War, and had expanded its empire into Spain. And during this time, there was something called yellow journalism going around, in which in which American journalists were not exactly telling the truth about what happened in the Spanish-American War, or even before the Spanish-American War, and the motivations as to why the United States went to war with Spain. So his views are considered progressive. Nobody knows exactly, or nobody can really pinpoint what his political views were. But besides his political views, he is certainly the face of American literature, and if you're a Southerner and you've been raised in the South, he is a prominent figure in Southern literature as well. All right, this is a works cited page if anybody's interested in reading about his biography or his encounters with anti-imperialist thought or abolitionist movement. You can certainly take a look at these sources. Thank you.